a Dogme lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to TEFLology, a podcast about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL Pioneers.
So today's TEFL pioneer is a man by the name of Francois Gouin. I don't know if Gouin. G-O-U-I-N. I'm going to go with Gouin.
Okay.
He is I don't know, have you ever heard of Francois Gouin?
I haven't actually, no.
Okay,
No.
Great. He was maybe considered a influence on Berlitz.
Ah, right.
The Berlitz. There's a few Berlitzes, right? Charles, was that?
Yeah, he was my favourite Berlitz,
Right,
but we'll
okay.
get to him later.
Yes. But he was French, and he was a teacher of Latin.
Okay.
And he was, I guess, a good teacher of Latin in that he was following the methods of the day and was very successful in having his students passed all their Latin exams.
Right.
But obviously I should mention, he was born in 1831, died in 1896.
Mm-hmm.
An idea of when he was around.
A very clear idea of when he was around.
Well, an idea of when he was active, I guess. So what he did was he was teaching his students how to memorize the rules of Latin, grammatical rules, vocabulary, etc.
Okay.
What he did is he decided he wanted to learn a language. He had obviously had a good understanding of all the rules of Latin, decided he wanted to learn a living language,
Right.
which was German,
Okay.
being quite close to him, geographically.
Yeah.
So what he did is he moved to Hamburg, and before he did anything, he locked himself in his room and just started studying German the same way that he taught Latin.
Okay.
So he decided what they called the classical process. He had a grammar book, a dictionary, and he practiced translation.
Right.
So he memorized all the grammar rules, he memorized lots of vocabulary, and then he would practice translating, I presume, French sentences into German.
Okay.
He memorized, I'm not sure, I think it was a few weeks he spent doing this. He just stayed in his room.
Mm-hmm.
Memorized apparently 248 irregular German verbs.
Okay.
Presumably the most frequent, 248 irregular German verbs. He memorized all the German grammar books. Basically, he knew all of the linguistic stuff he could about German, all the grammar rules. So he, a few weeks went by, he tested himself over and over again, he knew everything, and then he decided, okay, I'm going to go to, visit the local German university, Hamburg U, I presume, to try out his newly acquired knowledge. He wrote a book detailing this experience, also detailing what he did afterwards.
Was this a book that he was writing at the time, like a diary, or did he write it in retrospect?
In retrospect, he wrote this afterwards.
Okay.
The book is actually called The Art of Teaching and Studying Languages, and it details the method he developed because of this whole experience.
Right.
But in the book, he also explains what brought about this method.
And this was originally written in French?
In French, yes.
Right, okay.
Okay.
But very nicely translated into English. This is what he wrote about his first visit to the German university to, wow all these German professors with the German that he managed to teach himself, hold up in his room for a few weeks.
I see.
But alas, in vain did I strain my ears. In vain my eye strove to interpret the slightest movements of the lips of the professor. In vain I passed from the first classroom to a second. Not a word, not a single word would penetrate to my understanding. Nay, more than this, I did not even distinguish a single one of the grammatical forms so newly studied. I did not recognize even a single one of the irregular verbs just freshly learnt, though they certainly must have fallen in crowds from the lips of the speaker.
Okay, so doesn't seem very successful.
No, yeah. So, yes. So what he was experiencing, obviously, was this idea of, which maybe we've all experienced. I don't know, I studied French and German in secondary school. Do you guys study foreign languages in
Yeah,
secondary school?
French.
Yeah,
French.
For like
French.
5 years. Yeah.
Right. Do you remember your first time going to France and
Well,
trying to speak French?
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't, maybe not the first time. I
Right,
remember
right.
going to France and trying to speak French
Yeah.
because my mum forced me to.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I remember failing at it quite spectacularly.
Yeah.
So I went to France before I studied French, so
Okay.
I've never had the opportunity.
Right. I mean, obviously, maybe none of us memorized as many irregular verbs as Gouin did, but I think it's a very common feeling to feel like you've learned some of the language and then to realize, in practical terms, you know none of it.
Yeah.
But Gouin, he was a good student and a dedicated student. So what he did is he went back to his room and planned more study. This time he memorized 800 German word roots, and he started translating German writers, translating from German to French and back again. And then I guess he thought, okay, now I really know the language. And so he went back to the university,
Yeah.
this time really sure that he was going to be able to speak in German.
It's a triumph of hope over experience. So.
That's right. Imagine then, if it be possible, the astonishment at first, then the stupefaction, then the degradation by which I was overtaken after the first quarter of an hour at the lecture I attended, when I had to submit to the evidence and to confess to myself that I was, so far as regards the spoken language, exactly in the same state as upon the first day, that I did not understand a word, not a syllable, and that all my efforts had been made in pure waste. Yeah. So, he found this result. He didn't, he thought maybe that was a one-off. He went back, studied more German, and found it was the same problem.
Yeah. So he tried the same thing twice, and it didn't work either
Yes.
time.
He seems
Right, but it's, yeah.
He's got an odd approach. I mean, at no point did he ever think, well, maybe I'll just try and have a conversation with just one person,
Well, I think...
rather than learning 800 irregular verbs.
Was it just the irregular verbs he learned?
I think that might be his problem.
Well, those are the most common generally,
Okay.
but...
Yeah, it seems like he probably took too much on, if anything, and he can process everything in time, and he didn't have any chance to automatize the language as such.
Yeah, well, he had no interaction, So what always surprises me about these cases is that obviously for thousands of years people have been successfully learning foreign languages.
Yeah.
But the teaching of foreign languages, the kind of formalized teaching for thousands of years, or I don't know how long it's been going on, was grammar translation, memorizing grammar rules.
Yeah.
And Gouin, he had this experience, and then he went on to realize that that wasn't the way to learn how to use a foreign language.
Yeah.
But it's kind of amazing to think that it hadn't happened before, that other people hadn't come to this realization. Or I'm sure they have,
Yeah.
or had. So what happened to him then is he went. So he was completely deflated and very upset that he had been teaching his students for years Latin to learn a language this way, and then realized that actually it was kind of pointless.
Yeah. Although Latin is like a dead language.
Yes,
so
yeah, right.
It's not quite
Right.
the same urgency to learn the spoken form. So.
Of course, yeah. So what he did is he went back to France and I guess went to his sister's house and was explaining this terrible experience. And I think he had spent 3 years in total trying to learn German, going back and forth. And so he went to his sister's house as he was explaining this experience, and he noticed his 3-year-old nephew running around, speaking perfect French, obviously. And Gouin was very upset that the same amount of time that he spent putting all this effort into learning German, his nephew had learned French in the same amount of time.
Bit competitive, isn't it?
I know, it's
Unnecessary.
3-year-old, right? So then what he did is he decided to look at his nephew and look at how children acquire their first language. He saw that his nephew was very curious about the world, was running around, was experimenting with the language, was connecting. The key thing for Gouin was seeing how the nephew would observe something and then connect that to language. If that makes sense.
Yes.
So, yeah, I think this didn't necessarily lead him to a successful method of language teaching. He did develop a method, surprisingly not that closely connected. I mean, what he decided, he called it a method based on nature, which I think what he meant by that was first language acquisition.
Right.
he decided that the kind of grammar translation or the kind of sentences that were used were disconnected sentences.
Yeah.
You would learn the watch is on the table, then you would learn the monkeys in the tree, etc. And he said there's no connection between those sentences, and that's the problem. That's why these sentences become meaningless.
Yeah.
He decided that the way to do it was to have a series of sentences that were connected in meaning.
Right.
For example, the other thing he felt was that it was important to learn at the sentence level, which I think is some kind of progress. Yeah. He also said the verb was the soul of the sentence. He said the verb was the main, and that maybe that's a very, Romance language, or it's a very Eurocentric point of view in terms of languages.
Yeah.
But he developed this method where you would have basically these, I think, 8 or 10 sentences, series of sentences that were connected, and the teacher would explain them to the students, mimic them, mime them. The students would mime them.
How were the sentences connected? In what sense?
For example, I can give you a series, one of his series. His method was called the series method. Mm-hmm. The acorn sprouts, the oak plant takes root, the shoot sprouts out of the earth, the sap rises, the sapling throws out leaves, the stalk buds, the stalk blossoms, the flower blooms, the fruit forms, the fruit ripens, the fruit falls. So this is a series that I guess you can imagine, you can kind of see this progress.
Yeah, very conversational as well.
Yes, very interactive.
So there's lots of repetition. The imagery is kind of connected to each other in a very close environment.
Yeah.
I see.
He while he was doing this, making these series, he was also going through a dictionary and just crossing off words and making sure that he eventually made enough series that he...
Right,
yeah.
okay.
And all the 800 irregular.
Yeah, exactly.
This seems to be very similar to a lexical approach.
I guess, in a way.
Or the kind of foundations of a lexical approach.
Yeah.
I guess.
It's surprisingly, the series method, there are people still out there using the series method.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Whereabouts?
All over the place.
Wow.
you want to find some?
They're all around us.
They're all around us. I think, I think it has its roots in something that sounds commonsensical, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. But what I think, the method he created probably wasn't the greatest method, but I think he was maybe a pioneer in terms of being one of the first people to move us away from grammar translation to a more natural method.
Yeah. How much of his initial story, do you think is true, and how much do you think he kind of concocted in retrospect to sort of sell his method?
You're saying that I just made that all up?
No, not you. Him.
I'm sure, like any story, it's probably enhanced a little bit. But I think we've all experienced that, learning some language and then not being able to use it because we've just learned it from a book.
Sure.
What he decided was that learning through the eye was pointless. You have to learn through the ear.
Also, this man spent a lot of time in his bedroom, so he probably would have written quite a good story eventually.
Yeah.
You mean like an infinite number of monkeys?
Yeah, basically.
That theory?
Just keep bashing away at the story.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's Francois Gouin, this week's TEFL pioneer.
TEFL Cultures.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL Cultures section, I'd like to talk about, two directions that recent English language teaching is kind of taking, two different trends that have kind of emerged. Mm-hmm. One involves the teacher being very unplugged in their approach, and the other involves the teacher being very connected with technology.
Okay. Two polar opposites.
Well, yeah, basically two polar opposites that people are trying to argue that are coming together gradually, but I'll kind of dissect the two different approaches first.
Okay.
So as you know, core computer-assisted language learning is very prevalent in today's English teaching. Mm-hmm. Just think about your classrooms. How much technology have you used or do you use?
I have used quite a lot in the past. I don't use any now, but I've used these big multimedia suites for teaching TEFL, and I've used presentation courses and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I have used quite a lot of technology. I don't anymore, and I can't say I'm a big fan of using technology, but that might be my Luddite technophobe brain there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've used technology. For example, having students record themselves.
Yes, yeah.
And then being able to listen back straight away, transcribe their own interactions, those kind of things.
So there's some technologies that we kind of take for granted these days. CD players where we can listen to recordings of like real English, like even things like the whiteboards technology. It could be argued. I guess the buzzwords these days using smartphones in classes and getting students to use maybe games or things that weren't actually intended for language use in the classroom. I can remember a talk I went to a couple of years ago where the presenter was waxing lyrical about using angry birds in the classroom, and I kind of failed to see the connection between how the learners are going to actually learn any language from it, and they were kind of getting too carried away with the technology aspect of it. And this is kind of the problem that I want to talk about.
The new toy effect.
The wow factor.
I remember going to a talk. So when interactive whiteboards were just starting to become quite popular.
I hate those.
Right. So we, an organization that I was a member of, we invited Mario Rinvalucri. So we invited somebody from one of the interactive whiteboard companies, a teacher, but who was kind of, his job was to show people how to use them and promote them, I guess.
Yeah.
And then just to balance it out, we also invited Mario Rinvalucri to come in. He wasn't necessarily against them at the time, but he had reservations,
right.
and so he was there to kind of challenge the idea.
So
and his main point was just like you were saying, that when the technology becomes the main focus, when the teaching or the language learning itself gets subsumed.
Well, that's the thing. And it's the same with any kind of materials, I guess. The textbook often teaches the lesson, and the teachers kind of fail to see the connection between the language and the learners anymore, and kind of the technology or the artifice gets in the way. And in this particular case, it's kind of emerging technologies. I guess you'd call it smartphones and Web 2.0, those kind of ed tech. You're familiar with ed tech, that kind of online.
It's actually my favourite piece of technology research was about smartphones. It was in the Jiao Call journal. And basically this guy got a load of students and he gave some of them, it was about homework reading, so he gave some of them smartphones and some of them like just on the computer and some of them the reading on paper, and then asked them which one they liked. It turns out they don't like reading long English texts on smartphones. That was not a beautifully simple experiment. Very clear result.
So so our friend Stephen Bax, who we've mentioned before concerning the Voynich manuscripts, is a big proponent of this idea of technology normalization, and he argues that technology has 5 stages of normalization before it becomes invisible in the classroom and accepted, like a CD player in the classroom, for example. He talks about the early adopters phase, where a few teachers and schools adopt the technology out of curiosity. So, for example, that could be using an interactive whiteboard in the class for the first time, just giving it a try. The next stage is ignorance and skepticism. So most people are skeptical or ignorant of its existence, and they kind of say, well, you can't use that, you can't bring that into the room, we don't know how to use that. Okay, and then people continue, they try again, and then the next step is fear and awe, basically. So most people start to use it, but are still have the fear of alternating or an exaggerated expectation. Basically, people kind of overuse it, like we said. Basically,
you expect magic to come out of it.
Right.
So
this or just rely on it.
So this is kind of how it goes, basically.
The teacher you're talking about with the Angry Birds. In my mind, I just picture like the end of the lesson, the students just sitting there bored, and the teacher's playing Angry Birds.
Basically, So I think.
What I'd be doing.
So it seems that on one hand, some teachers are getting too caught up in the artifice of the lesson, the technological side of the lesson. And there's another movement on the other side that's calling for a materials light approach that's kind of emerged in the past 13 years or so. Are you familiar with Scott Thornbury's Dogme for EFL article?
Yeah, I'm very familiar with it.
So basically what Scott Thornbury talked about, must be 14 years ago now. He basically equated it to Lars von Trier films, and said that basically
Some Lars von Trier.
some the Dogme films,
Yeah.
basically, yeah. And he kind of said that, well, we need to get away from using too much artifice in the classroom. Why are we bringing in so many photocopies? Why are we using CDs when the teacher has his own or her own voice?
Yeah.
And so kind of just stripping away all of this technology. And yeah, over the past 14 years or so, what's come to be known as Dogme ELT is come to be quite a hot topic in teaching. Have you come across Dogme ELT yourself?
Yeah, I've got a copy of the book Teaching Unplugged. Yeah, I've not taught much Dogme apart from by accident.
Well, what I think about, and the biggest criticism obviously is that it's only applicable in certain teaching contexts.
Yes.
For certain levels of students, certain numbers of students, certain institutions, certain course aims.
Yeah.
I take a slightly... So what's interesting to me is to go back to the Lars von Trier. I mean, it wasn't just Lars von Trier, it was a group of Danish filmmakers.
Yeah.
And
Right.
it was about stripping away the artifice, but it was also about imposing limitations
Right.
and seeing artistically what came out of the imposition of limitations.
Yeah, well, that's one of the tenets of Dogme ELT, that it's all about emergent language. So what arises from the situation, and what do the learners bring to the class, and basically the idea that you're uncovering a syllabus and not trying to cover a syllabus or trying to bring in all these things, basically. The bit I want to focus on really is not the language side of it, the materials light aspect, which basically says don't go into class with lots of pre-planned materials. Go in with something very small, maybe just a paragraph, maybe something you found, maybe something on Twitter, for example, which I'll talk about later, and get the students to have conversation around the very small materials that you've brought in, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
So that
I guess that there are strong and weak versions of a Dogme lesson.
They are, yeah. I mean,
you can't bring anything in, or you just see what the students start talking about.
Because they've started to reevaluate what they mean by materials light, and at first they were saying, well, no, there's no technology. You have to work just with what you've got, the skills basically. So the new trend now is to kind of return to technology and say, well, can it be integrated into a Dogme ELT approach, basically? Can you be both unplugged and connected?
Well, considering that people always have a smartphone in their hands, in a way it's very Dogma-ish to acknowledge that fact, and to take advantage of the fact that they all have access.
I remember Harmer, I think, did a talk or wrote an article where he was saying that the thing is, like, Dogme, it sounds like a really nice idea, and when they started the film movement it sounded like a really interesting idea, but they kind of made a few films like that, and then they realised that actually it was quite nice to have all the different technology, because it helps you in a lot of different ways.
They'd always intended to only make a few films,
yes,
as far as I know. It was kind of an experiment. It was just to see what emerged from... I did what I consider... I mean, it's not a Thornbury Dogme lesson, but it's a... The other day I was teaching and I realized I didn't have a pen. I think I had markers, but I didn't have a pen to write down, to take notes in class, and all those things. And I had enough time to run up and get a pen, but I thought, no, I'm gonna just see what happens. I'm gonna see what happens if I'm forced to do the lesson without a pen. And it was a fine. There's no problems with the lesson, and it forced me to pay attention to things that I wouldn't be paid attention to if I was taking notes or listening for other things. So I think those kind of limitations are fine.
So the idea of being both unplugged and connected. So basically, if we say that a CD player is going to play two people speaking, basically, and the listeners are going to listen to it, well, they're not going to have a chance to communicate with each other. However, if we say that technology can be used to record each other speaking to one another, and to be used, like you said earlier, for instant playback, instant error correction, for example, this is one way that learners can be connected in the classroom in a kind of unplugged and stripped down manner.
Right.
Basically.
So you're saying that you can unify a kind of an unplugged Dogme approach with a highly plugged in call approach.
Yeah.
In some ways.
Well, that's basically what I'm saying. That it seems to have these two separate paths are kind of coming back together again, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So that's today's TEFL culture section.
TEFL news.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL news, we're going to be talking about Chinese linguistic nationalism. Have either of you guys heard about this story at all?
No.
No. Okay, good. I can tell you about it. So this was a story that was reported in a few different places, particularly in The Economist, or notably in The Economist. So the newspaper, the Chinese People's Daily, has published an article in the last couple of weeks claiming that there are too many foreign loan words in Chinese coming in from English and decrying this practice. So some examples were MBA, CEO, iPhone, like basically words that didn't exist in kind of more traditional Chinese culture, but have come in as English imports. And so there have been a few different reasons that were given in this article. So some Chinese experts, said that this is a result of laziness or infatuation with Western culture. I should point out the Chinese People's Daily is the Communist Party's newspaper, so yeah, keep that in mind. And they, in the article, they said that it was damaging the purity and the health of the Chinese language to have so many loan words coming in. Yeah. So, what are your general views about that?
I mean, for me, the maybe more interesting reasons, not behind why the loan words are coming in, but why it's a problem. So I think, I'm sure you'll talk about it, but other countries, other linguistic communities have occasionally had these problems with loan words. But I think it maybe says something about maybe politically what's happening in the country at the time, or the general mood of the country.
Yeah, well, I think that's interesting, and I think we can maybe get to the heart of it a little bit by looking at some similar incidents. So in Japan, where we are recently, there was a case where a 71-year-old guy named Hoji Takahashi sued NHK, which is a bit like the Japanese BBC, it's the national broadcaster, over the overuse of loan words in TV. So he was saying that the overuse of loan words had made the programs impossible to understand and had caused him emotional stress. So he was giving examples like kurisuku, which comes from risk, korabo, which comes from collaboration, and toraburu, which means trouble. And so these words were being used in the TV programs that he was watching, and he wasn't happy about it. And so he sued NHK for 1.41 million yen, which, if you don't know the exchange rate, that is a lot of yen. And he's also, it turns out, that this came out in later stories, he's the head of an association called Nihongo Taisetsu ni Suru Kai, which means the Association for Treating Japanese as Important. So he does have some kind of stake in this already. In this case, the court ruled against him and said that there's no proof that the use of foreign loan words can actually cause emotional stress, which is quite interesting. But the response from NHK, the company, was to broadcast a program explaining why it was necessary to use foreign words. Like there are too many new words, not enough Japanese words to replace them, and the Japanese words aren't as well known as the foreign words. So maybe this is kind of a parallel incident to what's happened in China. It's someone who is feeling that there are too many loan words coming in, that it's diluting the language, that, well, as the name of his association says, they should be treating their own national language with some importance. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm sure we can find cases in history of English-speaking countries bemoaning the presence of non-English, however they define that, words coming into English.
Yeah. I'm sure there have been. I can't think of any examples offhand.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think with the strength of English as an international language, it probably hasn't happened recently. I think maybe it comes down to just speakers of a language being very secure about their language. And so I think English speakers can be very secure that English is a quote-unquote successful language in the world, so the presence of loan words is not a problem. Yeah, and I think that is kind of at the heart of the problem in China, or the perceived problem in China. So one professor from a Chinese university said that language is a very important manifestation of cultural identity, and we should protect it from losing its appeal. So maybe the concern is that because English is such a strong language, and because China maybe wants to assert itself a little bit more, wants to be taken seriously, which, it should be, really, I think. They're concerned about the language not being
not being taken, or maybe not being taken seriously,
Yeah.
but being diluted by foreign loan words. Yeah.
Do you think that's a legitimate concern for language, that it can be diluted or weakened by the presence of loanwords?
I think it's a legitimate concern, but I'm not sure in this case it is. Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, well, it's all part of language evolution. So regardless of what some 71-year-old might do, languages evolve naturally. By for example, immigration, people moving around the world.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think it's kind of small. Perhaps these are very small steps in trying to kind of quash these attempts to. For the spread of English, for example, but I think that language would evolve naturally anyway.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say evolve, because some examples of these words, these loan words in Chinese, they're actually not pure English loan words. They're mixed words. So I'm going to try and pronounce these. I can pronounce half of these words because they're mixed Chinese and English, but gillivable means awesome or amazing. People mountain, people sea, very crowded. Zhuangbility, perhaps, it means boastfulness, and shability means foolishness. So these aren't pure linguistic borrowings. They're combining their own language with English in order to express themselves, which I wouldn't say is corruption so much as creative use of imported words. Yeah.
But these, I mean, that seems like a very artificial and deliberately created use, as opposed to something that naturally emerged. Like a contact language, a pidgin, for example, which would naturally emerge because of the situation. But this seems like they're being deliberately invented for maybe coolness or.
Well, perhaps it's difficult to say whether they've been deliberately invented or not. It doesn't really mention in these articles in what way. I mean, I can imagine them being deliberately invented, as you said. I could also imagine them coming about naturally with so many people studying English and so many English words in media and that kind of thing. But the reactions in China have been quite interesting. So as I said, this was this was from the paper, which is the kind of the mouthpiece of the Communist Party. But other newspapers disagreed with them. So I can't pronounce these words. Do you know how to pronounce that?
No idea. Xinhua?
Xinhua. The Xinhua Daily Telegraph said that what was needed to promote the purity for Chinese was a greater respect for usage choices made by speakers and not what they called narrow-minded linguistic nationalism. So maybe trying to give the power to the actual speakers of the language, not to the government. Yeah. And let people make their own choices. An online paper, which did write this in English, I should point out, it's a Chinese-English online paper, said that the real threat to Chinese is the Chinese People's Daily, the newspaper which published the original article, because it has a sharp tone and is constantly critical and hectoring of people and their language use.
I think the reference to linguistic nationalism, I think nationalism is a maybe key word in all of this, is that it's a, maybe they see it as a form of acceptable or the kind of nationalism that they can get through without seeming too overtly nationalistic. I think that is the undertone there.
And I think it raises the question of whether these words, as we mentioned before, whether these words are actually English or if they're Chinese. Because I know that there was a study, I think in was it Dalton maybe, in a study of Japanese speakers. They showed them all of these loan words, which we might say these are English words. But from the Japanese people's perspective, they were Japanese because they were they were using them in their own
Japanese words.
Like words like salaryman.
Yes.
We understand it as being English and we understand where it came from, but people outside of Japan may not understand that. But I think this is something that we might start seeing more of in the future. I mean, in the past, there's been similar cases in, for example, in India with the moves to get rid of English and replace it with other languages, and it's happened in a lot of different places. So I think we'll see more examples of this, and it'll be interesting how it plays out, I suppose.
I mean, they have tried to. So in France, maybe famously, they words like le weekend and the chewing gum. They, the Institute of French Language came out and said, no, you have to say le gomme à mâcher and the fandom sentiment. But of course, people don't. You know,
Yeah.
people, and especially young people, are going to
Yeah.
use language the way they want to. So.
Yeah, it's the King Canute of language institutes,
Yes.
trying to hold back the tide.
Exactly.
But I think it's I don't think much can be done, like, especially in the way that going back to the 71-year-old man, he can't stop it alone.
Yeah.
And young people will choose,
Yeah.
and it will naturally evolve.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a legitimate concern, but I think, for example, the case in Japan, I think that the way to deal with this is to just raise awareness about it and explain why this is happening. And make people, because I can see people feeling threatened by things, but I think the key to that is education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's the news for this week.
Okay, so thank you very much for listening to this week's TEFLology podcast. As always, if you do have any comments or questions or suggestions for us, do email us at teflology@gmail.com. Finally, we'd also like to say thank you to some of you who have started talking about us online on, for example, Twitter, and I think there's been a couple of blog posts that have emerged too with our podcast being mentioned. So it's very kind, and we appreciate the online chit chat.
Yeah. And if you would like to leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, that would of course be very welcome.
Good reviews.
Fair reviews.
Fair reviews.
Okay, so it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.